This is a series showing that coffee was sitting inside the systems that made the American Revolution possible. Trade, taxes, supply chains, public conversation, consumer resistance, and ultimately, American identity. Welcome to Brewing the Revolution.
Hello and welcome to episode 4 of Brewing the Revolution. I'm Dawn Kennedy. I'm the CEO of Convoy Road Coffee Roasters. And where we left off in episode 3 was the shots fired at Lexington and Concord in 1775. And I'd like to pick up from there, first setting the stage that the colonies were still very divided. And I know I'd spoken about it in the last episode, but I really want to reiterate it here, that when people were choosing to drink tea and seen as loyalists, we were judging based on the system that we thought they were supporting and not actually what they were just choosing to drink. And for people to drink tea, the way that we were interpreting that was they were unwilling to break with the British and they wanted to continue living under British rule, whether or not that was actually true. But giving up your tea meant breaking family ties, business ties, ties back to Britain. And it was a very difficult choice for people to make. Considering that we can't always connect the dots going forward, only backwards, nobody knew what was going to happen. After Lexington and Concord, the question became, well, what are we doing? And it's quite possible that patriots were like, well, we'll win the war and then we'll figure it out. And if we don't win the war, we'll all probably be hung for treason, but you guys can go back to drinking Earl Grey. So if we really take this next step of pick a cup, pick a side, on a human level, people were being asked to pick a symbol in their cup that really was maybe not indicative of their personal politics, but it became that much of a symbol that coffee was the patriot drink and tea was the loyalist, or a cup of betrayal would be another way to put it. So again, I have some more dates here for us to make sure that I'm being accurate. And if you know I'm not accurate, if you have something else, I have no problem being corrected, and you just drop them in the comments. And I would love to learn. If I made a mistake, I'm happy to correct it. So after the First Continental Congress, right, we go with the non-importation, non-consumption. We're going to have an official colonial boycott of British goods. We don't want you here. The British, in return, after they'd closed Boston Harbor, they had doubled down, is the only way to put it. But after Lexington and Concord in April of 1775, there is an interesting anecdote. There is a diary entry from a non-commissioned officer named Moses Sleeper. And he writes that after alarm drums firing and moving, once the firing was over, Sleeper and another non-commissioned officer went to Menotomy, now known as Arlington, and drank coffee at the Black Horse Tavern before returning to camp. So they had chosen coffee. Arlington, of course, is in Virginia. The fighting had already started in 1775. The Continental Army was actually stood up in 1775 in June 14th. And the conflict then became more, I can't call it nationalized because we still weren't the United States, but all of the colonies came together at that point and created a Continental Army. So instead of having local militias go ahead and have these skirmishes with the British, we were actually really organizing. On June 15th, 1775, George Washington was made the commander-in-chief. And even though the colonies were starting to act collectively at war, not everyone agreed with it. There were still quite a few colonists who thought it was foolish and thought that doing this was going to end very, very badly. Now, June 17, 1775 is the Battle of Bunker Hill. And this really showed in that moment that the conflict was not going away. We had not yet signed the Declaration. There was no independence as far as formal revolution. But at that moment, really after Bunker Hill, the American colonies realized that this was not going away. It was costly. It was real. This conflict was not going to end. without some kind of definitive action. And but the belief the British really felt the same way as well. So what happened? Well, the British decided that they were going to restrict all colonial shipping and trade. So after the Battle of Bunker Hill in September of 1775, Britain issued seize and detain orders against rebel American shipping companies and ports and shipping lines by the colonials. They declared that ships taken in violation of these seize and detain acts would be considered enemy ships. So even before war was declared, if you're declaring people who are in the shipping and maritime trades enemies, you've kind of declared war. So the blockade, basically under the Prohibitory Act, the British started banning colonial commerce and authorizing the seizure of those American ships in writing in full to be enforced on March 1st of 1776. So again, before we even declared independence. And at that point, coffee was no longer just a drink, it was smuggling cargo. Why? Because again, the colonials, if you go back to episode 1, had a Caribbean coffee trade, and they weren't relying on the British imports like they did for tea with the British East India Trading Company. So coffee had to get through blockades, and in some references, we could call it the smuggler's cup. So to get coffee in, American colonial ship merchants, they had to avoid blockades, they had to avoid British seizure of their ships, and they had to move through the war lanes and make new shipping lanes, and they were actually really good at it. So the coffee was no longer just a counter cup, the coffee was picking a side. It was no longer just a symbol. If you chose to drink coffee, you knew everything that it had to go through to actually land in your local store for purchase. So the colonies were they were rerouting commerce away from the British. And I've got a date here again of March 1776, after they said, hey, we're seizing everything starting today. Washington forced the British out of Boston, and the Continental Congress opened again in March and April. But Boston became Patriot-controlled space, if you will, and the war then really started expanding beyond Massachusetts, again, before the Declaration. So we reopened Boston, and coffee can start coming again through Boston. So by the time we actually get to the Declaration of Independence, it's almost 3 years since the Tea Party, and about 6 months or so after the Prohibition Acts and all of these sort of retaliatory acts of Parliament and the King that would not allow free trade within the colonies. So by the time we declared independence on July 4th of 1776, privateering had already started and it had expanded. So privateers were, of course, capturing cargo. They were moving as enemy ships, if you will, not really under any color of law necessarily. But coffee, tea, sugar, rum, molasses, cloth, arms, and other goods all became part of that war economics, including the idea that cargo then becomes combat. Now, there's some anecdotal things throughout the war where prisoners of war from the Continental armies, they refused tea if offered that in the prisons. There is the belief that even drinking the tea as a prisoner of war would somehow be aligning with the British. So there was some, and those are anecdotal. There's some entries here and there. But, it's really interesting that it became such a line in the sand for those who were fighting. Now, coffee didn't appear on the original rations list of 1774. I actually have some of that because, again, I went down a little bit of a rabbit hole. But what they did allow was, let's see, bread, flour, meat, fish, milk or rice, beer or cider, peas or beans, butter, vinegar, and soap. So these were the paper rations that the Continental Congress approved as standard army rations for their soldiers. What was interesting is even though coffee wasn't on there, there is a lot of notes in diaries and things where people would come and bring the troops bread and meat and coffee as rations out in the entrenchments and out in the field. It was seen as a patriotic thing to do and to bring comfort to the soldiers. So throughout the war, coffee, bread, meat, they were provisions that were often given by other colonists who supported the effort. And, we hear about the hardships of the Continental Army. We hear about how they were struggling with those supply routes and they were struggling to feed those people who were fighting and they were struggling to carry on the war effort. Yet the colonists at large found these items like coffee to be a morale booster and a comfort and a symbol of what they were working towards and fighting for. And I find that really interesting that they would note coffee as something they were fighting for. But here's the thing. We actually had a war outside Massachusetts, of course, and there's some things here about the Southern campaigns and the Caribbean supply connections, which I thought were interesting. So the Southern colony opened some Atlantic ports, including some smuggling ports for tobacco, rice, indigo, sugar, molasses, rum, coffee, and unfortunately, as the Civil War will show us, enslaved labor. But the Caribbean trade, because of not having to cross the Atlantic, was incredibly important to the supply lines during the American Revolution. And it was the coffee in the Caribbean that made it possible to smuggle that into the war effort and allow colonists or colonial soldiers to have coffee as an alternative to tea. Now, another very interesting anecdote was there is a diary entry from a redcoat, if you will, a British soldier who said that they had enjoyed a cup of coffee this evening over the fire while he was doing his daily journal. And, we would not say that a British soldier drinking coffee meant that he changed his politics. We can tell from the uniform which side he was on. It wasn't about the cup. But it was interesting that as messy as this all is in American history, we did judge other colonists at some level for what they drank. And we made their breakfast choice reflective of what we thought their broader political opinion was. So it's interesting that as we're brewing through the revolution, coffee stayed right here as part of the American identity, as far as having notes in diaries and things in journals, and people, anecdotally anyway, bringing rations of coffee, bread, and meat to soldiers so they could continue their war for independence. All right. Next time, we're going to talk about what happened after the war and how coffee really became part of the American identity. So thanks for tuning in. Again, I always forget to ask you to like, subscribe, and share if you've enjoyed this episode. And this is episode 4 of Brewing the Revolution. I'll see you on the next one.